All right, good morning, everyone. I'm going to introduce myself and then I'll be the facilitator and speaker today. All right, there we go. All right, my name is Joe Bischoff. I am Regulatory and Legislative Affairs Director with American Hort. Welcome to Cultivate. Thanks for making it here this morning. I know it's the first day. Things are just kind of kicking off and everyone's getting settled in, so thank you for making this presentation. I've been with American Hort for, well, it was ANLA. I joined ANLA 2.5 years ago, and now happy to be part of American Hort. Before that, I was with USDA, the Animal Plant Health Inspection Service. It's USDA APHIS, where I was a national mycologist. So I'm really a plant pathologist by training, but have been spending a lot more time more recently on insects and entomology and some of these issues that we'll be talking about today in the last year plus. So let's just dive right into it. I think we've all been hearing quite a bit of discussion around the issues of neonicotinoids and pesticides in general, and as it relates to bee health. And it's really an important issue and an important debate to have. Bees are really important for our environment and for our food system. It's estimated that they provide about $15 billion in added value, economic value to to ag. And they also are responsible for pollinating about 30% to a third of all the food we eat. So the fruits and the vegetables. They're also we can often look at them because of the way they live in symbiosis with plants and with our food system. We often, I think, look at them as part of as an indicator to the health of our environment. So I think with that in mind, we see that there's really, well, it's an important debate. It's also an emotional debate. And we see that reflected in a lot of the publications that have been coming out more recently. The ones that are on the board here in the presentation are just within the last month or so. And so you'll see, and just like any good marketing organization or group, in a lot of the press, they're trying to attract readers and or listeners in the case of NPR. And so a lot of of how this starts tries to grab that individual emotionally into the issue. And in a way they've done that is saying, hey, is this the end? Is this, what can we point at? What's the problem here? For a little bit of political expediency, but also to capture attention. So we're going to try to work through today sort of how we got here. Let's talk about bee health. Let's talk about how we got to where we are right now on this issue. Let's talk a little bit about the science, and then finally we'll finish off with what's our plans on trying to tackle this issue. So a little bit about bee health. And you'll often hear, or sometimes you'll see, this is a commonly used graph. And we'll hear about bee decline is often an umbrella term that captures a lot of things. It's not just about bee health. They're talking about the general number of colonies. And these are managed bee colonies that have, where we were back to World War II, kind of towards the peak that you see, to now. And while certainly bee health is a piece of it, and probably a small piece, it really is more reflective of our changing economy, more of a move away from, since World War II, moving away from ag, greater urbanization. You just see less people doing this kind of work, as we see in agriculture in general. So those numbers, while staggering, are really more reflective of just our changing demographics. This right here is, this is from the National Agricultural Statistical Survey. It's part of USDA, and they, since 2006, and some of you have heard of colony collapse disorder, which was a phenomenon really witnessed in 2006, they started tracking winter losses. And winter losses there's something that happened. This is, again, managed colonies, managed honeybees. There's something that happened every year and have always happened every year. It's, the bees are under greater stress during the winter, and a certain percentage of them die. Now, what we do see, though, and again, they started the survey in 2006, so we don't have the historic numbers, but we are at historic highs, generally. The number that people mostly throw out there as being what were typical losses is somewhere around 15%, give or take a little bit. So we do see higher levels of loss in the winter in more recent years, apparently. Now, that trend of these high losses hasn't been so consistent. In fact, just this past year, it was reported about a month and a half ago, USDA released the numbers, and we found that it had come down from where it had been in recent years. We lost about 23% of colonies. And also, when you consider that this was a pretty tough winter in many parts of the US, that number was somewhat surprising. In fact, you can even see, I'll just to point out, the blue bar, the blue portion of the bar is kind of what beekeepers had expected their losses to be. And then the red is what is above and beyond what their normal expectations would be. So you'll see just in this past year, there was the expectation that there would be greater losses. But then what actually happened wasn't didn't deviate as greatly from there as had been in recent years. So these are some positive signs. But it doesn't mean, just because we see, and I showed here, I'm going to flip back to this other graph quickly. Just because we see this, okay, these numbers, a lot of it can be explained by demographics. In actuality, the last bar there is based on 2007. Current year, the 2013 numbers actually put that total colony number really back at that 1997 level. So it's really flattened out. But it doesn't mean, when you look at these winter losses, it doesn't mean that the beekeepers are, they're not working hard for it. They are, because there are some significant challenges. So what do we need to do? To better understand this, to figure out as an industry how we adapt to this situation? Yeah, there's some exaggeration of the concerns, but there are real concerns, and we need to be respectful of those concerns, because bee health is a real challenge out there. So we really need to look at the science. We need to really look at what is the work that's going on out there, what can we reliably focus on to help us come to better conclusions, better outcomes in this situation. And if you look just in the last 2 years, there are 3 comprehensive reports. The first to the lower left, that's USDA. They published their stakeholder report in the fall of 2012. The one in the middle there, that is from the United Kingdom, and they had a very comprehensive evaluation basically done by their equivalent of USDA. And then that last one right there is from Australia. That's the Australian report that was just published earlier this year, and that was done basically by our equivalent of EPA. And what they all found, there was really broad agreement on this, that there is no one issue, there's no one challenge that is causing these concerns regarding bee health. It's a group of things. And you can look at things that are, pretty specific to beekeepers. Then it has to do with the growth in pollination services. Okay, so this is the idea that they take their hives and often travel long distances to provide pollination services for growers. The almond industry is the largest. Every January, February, when the almond trees bloom, it's the largest migration, man-made migration of honeybees to a location for pollination services anywhere in the world. It's approximately 2 million colonies are taken there. So that's a stress. Then you add in things like through breeding, the genetic diversity of bees, of kept bees, is really quite low. So that opens them up to greater challenges from pests and pathogens and things like that. But really, when you looked at those 3 studies, there were a few issues that were highlighted as the primaries. Things that were having the largest impact on bee health. And it was hands down, and actually I'll go further, that I was at a congressional hearing where Dr. Pettis, who until just recently was the lead bee researcher for the USDA Agricultural Research Service, he was there speaking and was asked to talk about bee health challenges, what are the biggest problems, and within the first few sentences, the first thing he said was Varroa mite. Absolutely. Now, Varroa mite is a mite that was introduced or first discovered in the US in 1986. And we know that it carries viruses and passes them along. So it's a pretty recent challenge for these bees. And they didn't co-evolve with it, so it's something that they're not accustomed to dealing with. And when he described it, I'll never forget, we were in this hearing and all these congressmen were up on their behind their desks listening, and he held up a grapefruit. And he said, if you can imagine that as a human, you had a parasite the size of a grapefruit, and sometimes multiple, attached to your back, sucking out blood, that's what it would be like living. I actually heard another researcher, so sorry for the vivid, but this is going to make it worse. Vivid description, but I heard another researcher recently describe it as if a rat was attached to your back all the time. That's what it would be like living with it. And then you include all the viruses and pathogens that they can pass. A tremendous challenge. You can see there's a bee larvae, which also, they are often also infested with varroa mites. The tracheal mite. So the tracheal mite, there's been some success on for honeybee production where they've been able to build in some resistance. Some colonies have it, some don't. It's also ephemeral, it doesn't always stick around. But tracheal mites are another mite that work their way into the spiracles. So these are basically the way that insects breathe. There are these kind of tunnels that are in the exoskeleton of these insects, and they get clogged up with these mites. And so the same researcher that I heard describe the rat reference, he described this as imagine having a bunch of cockroaches running around in your lungs. So, and what the impact was. Both really gross, and hopefully it's far enough before lunch it doesn't impact anybody's meal plans. But also they carry viruses as well. And there's a virus that actually deforms the wings and prevents flight or makes it difficult for flight. That also is, it's commonly seen in colonies, and it's something that is spread by the tracheal mite. Another huge challenge, and something, I don't know if you were all aware or saw the president's memorandum on this issue. So the Obama administration made an announcement about trying to gather all the various government agencies to come together and identify a way and a plan to move forward to try to deal with this issue. And a big focus of that was talking about habitat and forage. Okay, we are increasingly urbanized and suburbanized. And often those locations are basically deserts. They're food deserts for bees. Many people appreciate lawns and their landscape. Well, but if they're frequently mowed, there's not necessarily food there. So, this is an area where I think as an industry, we really should look for the opportunities and say, hey, we can be part of this solution. I absolutely think that we are part of this solution here. And the other thing is our agricultural system has been changing. We now have systems in place that allow many growers to grow their plants from hedgerow to hedgerow. So there's fewer weeds and fewer opportunities for forage. Also, with the increases in soy and corn prices, areas that have previously been kept in conservation are now being used for production because there's high value there. So these are all things that are really making it difficult for bees to deal with. Less food and less habitat. And then finally, the other big challenge, and I think we have to be honest with ourselves here, is pesticides is part of the issue. I mean, when we talk about insecticides, and I'm talking about insecticides in general right now, they are created to kill insects. Bees are insects. So if the two cross paths or in significant quantities, it has the potential to impact bees. But when we look at all the factors, we really need to tackle this in a smart and efficient and effective way. So why is it, with all of these issues going on, including pesticides, but why so much of the focus on neonics? Well, it's kind of an easier target. First off, it's a newer chemistry. When we look at really our options, there's really hasn't been a new insecticidal chemical class in our family in the last 50 years or so, other than this. So it's kind of like, well, it's new, it's got to be a bigger problem. It's part of this large ag system, so it's an easy target for many groups. Really, we really first saw these being deployed as a tool starting in the 1990s. It's now the most commonly used insecticidal group or class in the world. And again, it would be much easier if we could just say, hey, these aren't, there's no role in bee health that pesticides play. But it's a more nuanced conversation than that. And of course, groups who are on the other side and often want to push a zero pesticide agenda, they try to make it as clear-cut as possible and say, they're the cause. Well, we know that's not the reality, but we also have to appreciate and embrace our portion of where the reality is. So that's what we're trying to do here. So where did this all start from? Let's go quickly or briefly through the history here of where, at least in the US, this issue really has come to take on a life of its own. It really started last April, where the European Union voted by 15 to 20, or 15 out of 27 European Union countries voted to support pretty significant restriction. I wouldn't call it a ban. Some people will call it a ban. It's not a ban because there are some uses that are still allowed, but significant restriction of the use of neonics. And that ban went into place, or I just said ban. That restriction went into place beginning in December of 2013. So that started the conversation among many of the more activist groups, zero pesticide tolerance groups in the US. And just a month and a half or so later, after that vote took place, there was a large bee kill that occurred in Oregon. Just as luck and fate would have it, it happened the same week as National Pollinator Week, and it happened 15 miles down the road from the headquarters of Xerces, which is an invertebrate conservation group. So it was kind of the worst case scenario. And I don't know if you can make it out in that picture, but you'll see this is actually from the memorial service that some of these groups put together after the bee kill. And this person, photograph here, is eulogizing the bees. And then also you'll see that the trees have been bagged or covered. So it's quite the backdrop and quite dramatic. So basically this captured some media attention. Still, most of it more local, a little national, but not big media attention at this point. But then, shortly after that, a month later, the U.S. House of Representatives, in the U.S. House of Representatives, legislation was offered at the Ag Committee level, and it's called the Save America's Pollinators Act. And it didn't go anywhere. It didn't move out of committee, but it certainly broadened the conversation. Last August, Friends of the Earth put out their first study, and I use study loosely, just because some of what they were suggesting really didn't reflect what their real research was. But certainly it helped capture the imagination and brought some things to light, I suppose. And we've seen, more and more attention to this, and really from a national media standpoint, when Time Magazine did their piece last August, it basically ballooned from there. And now, since then, there's been a steady stream of attention and media reports to this issue. It's also been incredibly successful as a fundraising point for some of these activist groups. I know Friends of the Earth put out an announcement in January talking about that, I guess in the last 6+ months, the last 6+ months of 2013, they raised $250,000 on this issue. So it's also, it's an incredible tool for them to gather support. And then just recently, we saw that Friends of the Earth put out another self-published, not peer-reviewed, but self-published study. And we've seen some of the big box stores and some others come up with strategies to try to, or identify strategies that they want these things, any plants treated with a neonic labeled. So as an industry, what do we do? It's very, I'm not a business owner. I'm not in any of your shoes. I work for the association and try to represent the industry. So we're certainly respectful of the decisions that you have to make. At the end of the month, you guys have to make pay. But from an industry standpoint, we really are going to stick with following the science. We have a laser view on the science here. And we want to make sure that we are following and recommending what's most appropriate, not only for dealing with our pest challenges and considering the importance of human health consequences here, but also our environment. Because there's probably no industry that is closer to a set of customers that we're using the product, but our customers probably care more about this issue than the population as a whole. This is an important issue, so we need to care about it as well. So we're going to keep looking at the science. And when we do that, when we do that, the evidence that's out there right now really points us towards it's still an important tool. It's a safe tool when used appropriately, as directed by the EPA approved labels. And it's too important of something that we can just eliminate from our toolbox when we look at our challenges that we have. So let's talk about neonics in a little more detail and a little bit more about the science. So where do they come from? They're newer, right? So where's the concern here? Or why are we so concerned about, or why are some people so concerned about them? So neo comes from it's the Greek term for new. And then, so if you think of it as new nicotine. So nicotine has been known to have insecticidal properties for a long, long time. And, but it's also, nicotine is toxic to insects, but also toxic to other animals. So this really is a tweaked version of nicotine, and which keeps its properties for being effective on insects, but it has very low toxicity levels for animals, including humans. So let's talk about the pros and cons, okay? It's systemic, so it translocates throughout plants. Plants take it in various ways, and they can move it throughout the plant tissues. So that's great for dealing with the pests that come along and munch on the plants or stick their mandibles in and suck out phloem and things like that, and sugars. But then the con is that the concern is that these chemicals also then move into the pollen and nectar. There's some studies that suggest that, and there's some studies that support that it goes there. And I think we have to assume that it does go there, but we just don't know in what concentrations. We don't know for how long it's there. We don't know how it dissipates. These are all questions that we need to answer. Longer residual. So it sticks around longer, the neonic, right? It gets pulled in and it sticks around in the plant longer than some other chemicals that are other insecticides that might be sprayed in a broadcast spray. Well, that means fewer applications. That means fewer opportunities for interacting with a bee, with a non-target insect, specifically a bee. But then other groups will say, well, longer residual is a problem because that means it's sticking around in the environment longer and more opportunities for interacting with non-target insects. True. Okay, so there's a pro and a con there. Okay, but when we look at the chemistry itself, we do know that in comparison to a lot of the other chemicals, or other options, or other tools in the toolbox, the neonic is really, from a human health and an environmental health standpoint, when we look at birds and fish and our pets, it's safer. than our other options out there. You can't forget that. And often that gets lost in the dialogue. You often hear this tremendous concern for bees, which is warranted, but the human health aspects are really often not considered, and that's a shame, and we need to be talking about that. And it's very effective on target insects, especially when used as part of a management strategy. So when you include other practices, and that could be including, integrated pest management, when you include things like scouting, other chemical classes, it provides, it's an important portion of that management strategy to maintain, or to keep those populations low or eradicated in some cases. In fact, for some insect pests, some of our most problematic insect pests, and we're talking about not just the landscape, but also in our environment, it's the most useful tool. Neonics are the most useful tools. So we have here Asian longhorn beetle. There are parts, and actually in parts of Ohio as well, in southern Ohio, where this pest itself, if allowed to spread, could wreak havoc on our landscapes, but our natural environments. It has such a broad host range, and it does not require a weakened plant in order to infest. Tremendous issue, tremendous problem. USDA is very involved in trying to eradicate it from different states, and we've had some success, largely due to the use of a neonic. Emerald ash borer, I think we've all seen the kind of damage that can happen to our ash trees, certainly here in Ohio, and many other states where you drive down a highway and you can see, you just look into the forest on either side of the highway and you see dead ash trees sticking out there. Well, emerald ash for a neonic is an incredible tool in managing emerald ash borer. And then hemlock woolly adelgid is another example. So this is the eastern hemlock, basically going down, well into the Carolinas, might even get into Georgia a little bit, all the way up to Maine, where this pest is decimating this plant. And it's a very, the neonic class is a very effective tool. And in fact, in the Great Smoky Mountains, I've heard and read reports where they say without the use of a neonic, there would not be a hemlock left in the Great Smoky Mountains. It's an iconic tree in that national park. And the loss of that plant that tree would be devastating. And it was only due to the treatment with a neonic that really kind of has been able to maintain it. We also have to deal with and use a neonic in dealing with some of our regulatory issues. So as part of the Japanese beetle harmonization plan, and this is basically a plan that's negotiated between the various states through the National Plant Board, that says, okay, here are a set of practices that you need to do in order to ship plant material from a state that has Japanese beetle to a state that either doesn't have it or it's not established. Part of that harmonization plan is the use of a neonic. So not only is it's not always, as I've been pointing out here, it's not always a tool about trying to make sure our plants are pretty all the time. We need it for regulatory purposes, and we need it to control invasive species. So where is the pressure coming from? So, I'm in Washington, D.C., so we try to advocate for the industry, deal with the various issues on the territories in which they fall. And at the federal level, now there are some states where there's been some legislation introduced and some challenges there for sure. But at the federal level, we haven't seen a whole lot of movement to restrict the use of neonics. There was that one bill that was introduced last year that did not move out of committee, but other than that, we haven't seen a whole lot. And in fact, I mentioned that there was an ag committee hearing, where Dr. Pettis from USDA spoke. Also speaking there was Jeff Stone, who is the executive for the Oregon Association of Nurseries. He was there. American Hort staffed him and helped him out with his testimony, and he presented our industry's perspective very well in talking about the issue and our challenges and how we want to approach it from a stewardship sort of philosophy. So we do see generally the support there. And then also, from a regulatory standpoint, EPA has generally been supportive of keeping this tool in the toolbox. They understand the utility. They understand the other tools we would be forced to go to without it, and that the health implications and how this is actually a wiser choice in many cases. Our biggest challenge is really from the public perception standpoint. That's where we're losing this battle right now. Quite honest, we're losing this battle right now. It's, as I was pointing out earlier, with the media attention that it's garnered, the way the message has been crafted around that, and in some cases, you know, the resources that some of these groups now have to bear have made it very difficult to have a robust and broad conversation on the topic rather than just these sound bites, because it really requires a broader conversation. So where do we go from here? Well, we really look at this. What are we going to do as an industry? What we want to do is really, it's a three-pronged approach. Okay, we would certainly want to support the research. We want to identify how much of the chemical moves into the pollen and nectar. How quickly does it dissipate? Are there ways for us to better time its application in situations where it's necessary? There are also cases, we have many plants that we deal with where a bee doesn't go to them. Okay. In the other cases, we have many plants that we grow for the interior, you know, for indoor use, and you know, bees are not going to be visiting them as well. So we want to make sure that we have a research discussion about that and figure out how we can take that information and best deploy it and inform our industry on how to move forward. We are currently working on a stewardship program or stewardship practices that we can then share with the industry and say, hey, here are some things you can do to deal with bee health, okay, pollinator health. This stewardship program, as it's coming together, it's not all about pesticides, and it shouldn't be, because pesticides are not the big boogeyman in this situation. So it really needs to be about embracing the ideals and the hopes of improving bee health. So a piece of that is going to be trying to encourage and help in situations in dealing with habitat and forage that we identified, and many groups have identified, and even the president in his memorandum identified as a major challenge to bee health. So stay tuned on that. We are working on that. And then also, we are partnering with other groups to try to help us deal with, respond, and identify those stewardship practices. A couple of groups that we do work closely with on these issues and have for a period of time on some other issues, but like groups like Pollinator Partnership, which is it's a group that looks to certainly move the meter in improving things for pollinators, but doesn't have a sort of zero-sum approach to this issue. So they're good partners in this situation. Another potential partner could be, you know, the Nature Conservancy, where we have partnered with them on other issues. You know, part of what we saw from the president's memorandum was the idea of public and private partnerships. Well, we are certainly looking to do that as well. Just a few weeks ago, we were in to meet with the USDA's point person for the secretary on this issue. And we talked a little bit about our program and where we're going with it, and that we'd like to kind of plug in USDA to help us craft it in some cases, deliver the message out there, share with people what we're doing, and they are absolutely on board and looking forward to that partnership as we move forward. So we do have a robust approach, we think, to trying to deal with this. And a lot of this is about, you're getting your customers right now, they're coming to you and saying, hey, we're hearing about these concerns about bees and pesticides. Well, what are you doing? Are these plants that you're selling me, are they a problem? Are you doing something about this? And right now, we've been in a situation where we try to have the robust conversation about it, but it's really difficult. You know, people often don't want to. They lose attention after a little while. So what we need to do is really change the conversation a little bit. We need to direct them to a positive message that we are working on something. That there's going to be this program there, okay, that embraces this approach of bee health, and that this industry is taking a leadership position in responding to that concern. And I think by changing that conversation, we'll be in a position for keeping the tool in the toolbox, keeping those customers, and in actuality, really moving these bee health concerns forward. So also, I wanted to put this up there for reasons. One, it's appropriate. Also, when we talked about partnerships, in this situation, EPA, which we often sometimes have a hard time with, in this situation, EPA is very much a partner. Okay, and their message of read the label. They've created this new bee advisory box, and so look for the little bee symbol on any of the products that you might be using, and always remember that the label is the law. So follow the label. Encourage your customers to follow the label, and that's a message we need to continue to drive home. Remember, when that first bee kill happened in Oregon, and others that have happened in other places, maybe not as dramatic, but in the vast majority of cases, in the Oregon case specifically, it was really a misapplication of the chemical. Okay, so these were sprayed on linden trees. In that situation, it was linden trees that were in flower during the day. Bees were actively going there. All a situation that says, do not use. And unfortunately, the individual did use it. So it really needs to be a sobering reminder that you're stewards of your land, you're stewards of your business, but we're also stewards in use of these chemicals, okay? They are powerful. So we have to use them wisely and respectfully. And I think if we do that, we'll be able to accomplish what we need, but also improve the situation for pollinators. So with that, I just want to thank you all again for being here. We publish or write and put content out on this issue very frequently, a whole lot. Starting last August, we had published frequently asked questions and responses to those. Talked a lot about what I talked about today, but also a lot more in-depth information on there. Please go to American Hort, the Knowledge Center. You can type in neonicotinoid, or you can type in pollinator. That'll bring up a bunch of articles if you do a search. If you put in my name, you'll find a bunch of things, because I've been writing a lot of stuff a whole lot. But also that link in particular that's up there, that's kind of something that we published a couple of months ago that is fairly thorough in describing the situation. Also would encourage you, if you have questions, concerns, at any time, please contact us. We're there to help, and we are working very actively on this issue. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions. I don't think there's anybody speaking right after me, so we might have a little extra time too. Yes?
Correct that you don't know or not know how much of the active ingredient or the chemical is in the pollen?
Yeah, and I should point, for anybody who has additional questions, if you wouldn't mind going to the microphones, but I'll repeat your question. Your question had to do with, is it true that we don't know how much pollen, or how much of the chemical gets into the pollen and into the nectar? We really don't. We don't. Now, most of the studies have really looked at the impact of these insecticides on bees have really been dosing studies or force feeding, cage studies. And as you can imagine, it's an insecticide, and if a bee is forced to consume large quantities of this insecticide, it will alter, if not kill them, it will alter their behavior. A big reason why we really don't know the answer to that question is it's not easy to do. The amount of pollen or nectar that you need to actually to execute the evaluation is pretty large. I've heard one researcher describe to me, you need about a gram. And a gram of, depending on the plant, some are easier than others, but depending on the plant, gathering it into a vial, a gram of pollen and a gram of nectar is a pretty time-consuming and expensive task. So that's why it hasn't happened yet, but it is something we are trying to gather support to do, because it's not just also going to be a snapshot. There's going to be different concentrations at different times. We often think about when these chemicals are applied, it gets into the greenery, right? It gets into the stems and leaves and things like that. Then it goes into the flowers. Then after the flowers develop, that's when the pollen and nectar starts to develop. So the timing, we might see that there's higher concentrations, and this is why the Friends of the Earth study, where they really focused more, especially on the first one, they focused more on the greenery, and then they tried to extrapolate that out into pollen and nectar. it may not be reflective of the reality at all. We just don't know. But they're legitimate questions and questions we need to have answers to. Any other questions? Yes. Hey, Ray.
Yeah, Joe, you mentioned great employee Kansas City University entomologist. We'll be working on looking at some of this. You talked about the issue of pesticides, but when you look at the actual data that's come out of some of the assessments on what's in pollen, it's mostly fungicides, chlorothalonil, and some of the miticides that the beekeepers are using, like the amitrax and permafrost, to actually kill the varroa tree.
Right. That's a great point, Ray. We talked about the biggest challenges that these beekeepers have, right? So we kind of ran through four, but the first and foremost was really the varroa mite. Well, to manage the varroa mite, these beekeepers are regularly applying miticides. So, a mite isn't quite an insect, but it's darn close. So you got to think that when these applications are happening, that it's also having a pretty significant impact on the health of the bee. So there has been some issues with beekeepers. The bee industry isn't quite as well organized as some other groups of agriculture. And so, the rates of what they're applying it's been inferred, haven't always been followed as closely as they need to be as well. So, I think for beekeepers, they really need to be thinking of themselves almost as livestock, farmers or ranchers. I mean, that's really what we're talking about here. So I think as they mature as well, and we can collaborate together, I think we're going to help move this issue forward. But yeah, Ray, that's a great point. Dealing with the very challenge that they have with the mites is adding certainly to the chemical mix that is then found in the hives. Any other questions? All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your time, and please enjoy the rest of the show, and I hope to see all of you around. Thank you.